Picture this. It's around 200,000 years ago, somewhere in ancient East Africa, and a group of ancient humans is doing something that should, by any reasonable biological accounting, be going very badly for them. They are sharing a landscape with cave lions, spotted hyenas, leopards, crocodiles, and various other large carnivores that outweigh them, outrun them, outclaw them, and outbite them by margins that would make any wildlife documentary narrator reach for the somber music. An individual ancient human, caught alone in the wrong place at the wrong time, has essentially the same survival odds as any other medium-sized mammal that wanders into a lion's hunting radius without adequate defenses. And yet here they are, not extinct, not rare, not confined to a narrow ecological refuge where predators happen not to operate. They're moving across open savanna in daylight, sleeping on the ground at night, raising children who are extraordinarily helpless for years, and somehow managing to not only survive every apex predator their environment throws at them, but to eventually, systematically make those predators nervous about them instead. How? How does a hairless, slow, physically unimpressive primate without claws, without armor, without serious natural weapons, navigate a world containing things specifically built to kill and eat exactly that kind of animal, and come out the other side not just surviving but thriving well enough to eventually spread across essentially every environment on the planet? Stick around, because the answer to this question is one of the most interesting, most cognitively rich, and most practically impressive stories in the entire ancient human record. And it reaches across fire technology, weapon development, social structure, behavioral ecology, and accumulated knowledge in ways that explain not just how ancient humans survived apex predators, but why that survival eventually became one of the most consequential ecological facts in the history of life on this planet. Start with the honest baseline, because avoiding false heroism matters here. Ancient humans did not simply waltz through their apex predator-filled world without incident. Archaeological and paleontological evidence confirms what common sense suggests. Ancient humans were killed and consumed by large predators throughout the deep ancient era. Skeletal remains showing carnivore tooth marks, skeletal assemblages in predator lairs suggesting ancient humans as prey items, and the general ecological reality of being a medium-sized primate in an environment with abundant large carnivores all indicate that predation was a real, recurring feature of ancient human mortality rather than an occasional unusual event. The question isn't whether ancient humans were ever killed by predators. They were. The question is how they managed overall mortality from predation well enough to maintain and grow populations in environments where predation pressure was constant and severe, and how that management gradually shifted from desperate reactive survival to something approaching systematic predator management that eventually pushed the balance dramatically in the human direction. The first and most fundamental survival mechanism was group living, and this deserves more direct treatment than it typically receives in discussions of ancient human-predator survival. A single ancient human encountered by a cave lion in an open field is simply prey. 5 ancient humans encountered by the same cave lion in an open field is a problem the cave lion may decide isn't worth the risk. 20 ancient humans with coordinated noise, fire, and thrown objects is something the cave lion almost certainly decides to leave alone. The mathematics of predator-prey risk assessment shift dramatically with group size, because predators risk injury with every attempted kill, and injury in a world without medical care is potentially fatal even for apex predators. Most large carnivores operate on a cost-benefit calculation that weighs the caloric value of a potential prey item against the risk of injury from pursuing it. Prey animals with effective group defense, social alarm systems, and coordinated defensive responses impose elevated injury risk on predators attempting to isolate or attack them, which shifts that calculation away from attack and toward targeting more vulnerable alternatives. Ancient humans in sufficient group sizes with the coordination to respond collectively to predator presence were able to shift this predator cost-benefit calculation in their favor without any technology at all, purely through the mathematics of coordinated group defense. This group defense required and rewarded social cohesion and coordination capability that itself had survival value beyond predator defense, reinforcing the selection pressure toward the kind of social complexity we've documented throughout this series as central to ancient human success across essentially every domain. Groups that coordinated better survived predation better, and also hunted better, foraged better, and managed resources better, creating a positive feedback loop between social sophistication and survival that drove human social capability progressively higher across the ancient era. Fire changed the predator equation in a specific and dramatic way that we covered in detail in earlier videos, but that deserves revisiting specifically in the predator survival context. Most large terrestrial predators maintain a deep, evolutionarily ancient aversion to fire that doesn't require any learned experience with fire's dangers to activate. This aversion is distributed across essentially all large carnivores, reflecting a very long evolutionary history, in which fire was a significant environmental hazard that animals without the ability to control or use it benefited from avoiding. Ancient humans' ability to maintain, carry, and deploy fire gave them access to this deep predator aversion as a protective mechanism. A fire-maintained camp perimeter at night converted the specific vulnerability of the sleeping state, which we discussed in our sleep video as a period of maximum individual vulnerability, from something predators could easily exploit into something they actively avoided. The combination of firelight and smoke effectively extended the ancient human defensive perimeter far beyond what group alertness alone could achieve, allowing deeper sleep with lower individual vigilance requirements while the fire provided continuous deterrence across the sleeping period. This was not a trivial advantage. Night is when most large terrestrial carnivores operate most effectively, and ancient humans without fire were genuinely vulnerable across the entire nocturnal period in ways that fire completely transformed. The ability to deliberately deploy fire toward predators, not just maintaining it as a passive deterrent, but actively using it as a directed threat, represented a further escalation that gave ancient human groups an offensive capability against predators that no other prey species had ever possessed. A group of ancient humans advancing toward a large predator while carrying and directing fire was a behavioral situation that no large carnivore's evolved behavioral repertoire had developed specific countermeasures for, because nothing in their evolutionary history had ever presented this combination before. The uncertainty and novelty of this threat may have been as important as the fire itself in making predators retreat, since predators calibrated by evolution to assess threats they recognize had no reliable framework for assessing a novel threat combining familiar humans with controlled fire. Weapon technology and its specific application to predator deterrence and defense represents another layer of the answer that requires careful examination. We've discussed projectile weapons extensively in the context of hunting, but their defensive value against predators deserves separate treatment. A projectile weapon that can deliver injury from distances exceeding a predator's charging range converts the defensive equation fundamentally, because a predator considering an attack must now weigh not just the risk of defensive counterattack at close range, but the possibility of being injured before that close range is achieved. Large predators approaching an ancient human group armed with effective throwing weapons and atlatls were potentially receiving projectiles before they reached striking distance, an entirely novel situation in the evolutionary experience of any ancient predator lineage. The behavioral uncertainty this created, combining unfamiliar threat type with genuine injury risk at unexpected range, is exactly the kind of situation that favors predator avoidance over predator attack in any cost-benefit calculation. Predators that experienced painful or injurious encounters with armed ancient humans would have developed individual learned avoidance. And if social learning operated within predator groups, as it does in many social carnivore species, that learned avoidance could spread to non-directly affected group members. The relationship between ancient humans and specific apex predators in shared environments was almost certainly more dynamic and more interactive than a simple, fixed hierarchy suggests. Different predator species had different relationships with human groups based on their own social structure, cognitive capability, and the specific history of encounters in each local area. Spotted hyenas, which are cognitively sophisticated, highly social, and capable of significant behavioral flexibility, almost certainly developed the most complex and most variable relationships with ancient human groups, including competitive scavenging interactions, occasional predation on isolated individuals, and apparently mutual learned avoidance in areas where human groups were established and armed. Lions, particularly cave lions of the ancient era, which were significantly larger than modern lions, represented perhaps the most consistently serious predator threat to ancient human groups based on size, hunting effectiveness, and wide geographic distribution overlapping with ancient human range across Africa and Eurasia. The evidence that ancient humans eventually began hunting lions, as suggested by lion remains at ancient human sites and lion depictions in cave art that may reflect cultural significance attached to particularly dangerous prey, indicates that the human-lion relationship eventually shifted from purely defensive to actively competitive, with ancient humans claiming lion territory and resources rather than simply avoiding lion presence. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Crocodiles represent a different category of apex predator threat that ancient humans living near water sources faced continuously and that required specific behavioral adaptations to manage. Crocodile attacks are ambush events that happen at water margins during water access activities that ancient humans couldn't avoid because water access was non-negotiable for survival. Managing crocodile risk required specific behavioral protocols, approaching water sources in groups, maintaining vigilance during water access, using specific crossing techniques at known safer locations, and incorporating knowledge of crocodile behavior patterns, activity timing, and location preferences into the accumulated ecological knowledge that ancient groups maintained. The accumulation and transmission of predator-specific behavioral knowledge was one of the most important components of ancient human-predator survival that tends to receive insufficient attention. Understanding specific predators' hunting methods, approach patterns, preferred terrain and conditions, behavioral signals preceding attack, and responses to defensive behaviors required and rewarded detailed, sustained observation of predator behavior that built into a practical ethology of local predators maintained through oral tradition across generations. Ancient humans in a given territory accumulated, over many generations, detailed knowledge of the specific predators they shared that territory with. Knowledge that was qualitatively different from the more general prey avoidance behaviors that other prey species relied on. Knowing that a particular species typically approached from downwind rather than directly, that a particular individual predator in the local area had a specific behavioral pattern, that certain times of day and certain terrain types were associated with elevated attack risk, that certain vocalizations from nearby animals indicated predator presence before any direct sensory detection was possible. This kind of specific, accumulated, transmitted predator intelligence gave ancient human groups a significant predictive advantage over the more reactive threat detection that most prey species relied on. Reaction to a charging predator leaves very limited options. Anticipation of predator presence before attack initiation leaves much more. The dogs or proto-dogs associated with ancient human camps from the early stages of proto-domestication we discussed in our dog-wolf video provided an important extension of this early warning system. Canine hearing and olfactory sensitivity extends threat detection range far beyond what human senses can achieve, and proto-dogs that were integrated enough with the human camp to alarm at approaching predators were providing a genuine defensive service that translated directly into improved ancient human-predator survival outcomes. A camp with alert dogs was harder to approach without detection than a camp without them, which meant earlier warning times, better preparation for defensive response, and more favorable odds in any resulting encounter. Ancient humans' ability to move between environments rather than being restricted to specific habitat types that their adaptations were optimized for represented another significant factor in predator survival. Unlike prey species whose defensive adaptations were specific to particular predator approaches in particular habitats, ancient humans could adapt their defensive behaviors to different predator types in different environments by applying the same cognitive and social toolkit flexibly across contexts. Moving into a new environment with unfamiliar predators was challenging and probably costly in terms of initial predator encounters, but the same capacity for rapid learned behavioral adjustment that served ancient humans across every other domain of survival applied to learning the local predator landscape in ways that other prey species couldn't match. The specific case of ancient human expansion into environments with no prior human presence, including environments with predators that had never encountered humans before, represents a particularly interesting chapter in this story. Predators in human-naive environments would have had no evolved or learned wariness of humans, making the initial encounters during ancient human range expansion potentially more dangerous than encounters in areas where predator populations had previous human experience. The fossil and paleontological evidence for for megafauna decline following ancient human arrival in previously uninhabited territories suggest that predator populations that lacked human experience were eventually more vulnerable to human hunting than their experienced counterparts in areas of longer human-predator coexistence, reflecting a dynamic where the learned caution that predators with human experience had developed was actually a form of predator adaptation to human presence that worked in both directions. The psychological dimension of ancient human-predator survival deserves direct acknowledgement because maintaining the functional capacity to respond effectively to genuine predator threats required managing fear in ways that prevented incapacitating panic responses while preserving the arousal and alertness that genuine danger required. Ancient humans who were so paralyzed by fear that they couldn't execute effective defensive responses when predators appeared were as vulnerable as those who were too complacent to maintain appropriate vigilance. The effective management of fear responses in genuinely dangerous situations was itself a survival-relevant psychological capability that ancient human groups cultivated through experience, social modeling, and the kind of experiential learning that comes from surviving threatening encounters. The young ancient human who had never experienced a predator encounter would have received both information about predators through the accumulated oral knowledge of their group and direct experiential calibration through encounters of escalating proximity and intensity as they participated in group responses to predator presence alongside more experienced adults. The graduated exposure to predator situations in the context of an experienced group's coordinated response provided both practical knowledge and the psychological calibration needed to maintain functional effectiveness under genuine threat rather than collapsing into panic. Something worth examining specifically is the transition point where the ancient human-predator relationship began shifting decisively in the human direction at the population level, where specific predator species began showing declining populations in areas of sustained ancient human presence. This transition happened at different times in different geographic regions, corresponding to different ancient human technological capability and population density levels. But the general pattern of large predators declining in areas where ancient human populations were established and growing is visible in the paleontological record across multiple continents and multiple time periods. This decline reflects the eventual accumulation. Of all the factors we've discussed, crossing a threshold where the combined effects of fire, weapons, group coordination, accumulated predator knowledge, and population growth made ancient human groups not just defensible, but actively competitive with apex predators for territorial space and prey resources. Ancient humans competing with lions for prey and winning consistently enough to affect lion population sustainability in the shared territory represents an ecological shift of enormous significance that had never occurred before in the evolutionary history of the predator species involved. Nothing in any large predator's evolutionary history had prepared them for competition with a prey species that could organize, plan, and execute at this level. The eventual result, visible across the deep ancient record in the form of gradually declining large predator populations in areas of long human occupation and altered predator behavior patterns in areas of sustained human presence, represents the accumulated outcome of the survival strategies we've discussed, compounding across thousands of generations into something qualitatively different from simple prey survival. Ancient humans didn't just survive apex predators through better defenses, they gradually displaced them from ecological positions through the same combination of cognitive capability, social organization, and technological development that made ancient humans effective across every other domain of survival. So how did ancient humans survive every apex predator? Through group size and coordinated collective defense that shifted predator cost-benefit calculations away from human groups as target choices. Through fire that converted the most dangerous period of vulnerability into a protected zone where predator approach was actively deterred. Through projectile weapons that extended the risk of injury for predators beyond the close-range confrontation that evolved, predator attack strategies were designed to negotiate. Through accumulated, transmitted predator-specific behavioral knowledge that gave ancient human groups predictive rather than purely reactive capability. Through proto-dog early warning systems that extended threat detection range beyond human sensory limits. Through the behavioral flexibility to adapt to different predator types in different environments without needing specific evolved adaptations. And through the gradual escalation of all of these capabilities across the ancient era until the accumulated effect shifted the ecological balance from ancient humans as prey to ancient humans as the most significant competitive pressure any apex predator in their environment had ever faced. The cave lion at the tree line in today's ancient Africa wasn't deciding to leave that group of ancient humans alone because of anything as simple as their fire or their spears, though those mattered. It was deciding to leave them alone because everything about the situation, the group size, the coordinated attention, the maintained fire, the previous encounters that had contributed to a learned assessment of what engaging with these animals cost, added up to a calculation that favored moving on. And across generations of lions making that same calculation across thousands of encounters, the behavioral profile of cave lions in areas of human occupation shifted measurably toward avoidance. That shift, multiplied across every apex predator in every environment that ancient humans occupied, is how our species survived the gauntlet of the ancient predator world. Not by becoming physically superior to the things trying to eat them, by becoming too cognitively and socially sophisticated to be worth the trouble.